The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey. Overall, I think this one's a pretty good movie. You know, it definitely stays true to the book for sure. I think this is probably the one that probably stays most true to the book. I think the only thing that they added, obviously, were the whole subplot with Gandalf, which they took different moments from the appendices at the end of the Return of the King book and then sprinkled it through the movie. The whole subplot of Gandalf meeting with the White Council and talking about the Morgul Blade and how it could be Sauron regaining power again, and the whole investigation at Dol Guldur, and the whole necromancer and all that storyline. So I appreciate that they were trying to expand the movies a little bit more and not just be like a self-contained adventure story. I know originally they were trying to do 2 films. It was going to be The Hobbit, and then The Hobbit Part 2 was going to kind of be a bridge film between The Hobbit movie and then Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I thought would have been interesting. But then as they were developing, they realized that The Hobbit movie is actually a lot more complicated than they thought. They decided to get rid of the bridge film idea and then just expand The Hobbit movie into 2 parts. So I think that would have been really cool. I don't know, originally it's going to be The Hobbit, Unexpected Journey, and then The Hobbit There and Back Again, which actually would have been great. But then as time went on, Peter said there was just like a lot more story to tell, so we decided to go from 2 movies to 3 movies. But we'll get to that in a second. Back to Unexpected Journey. So then we also start off with a prologue. It's kind of like an in medias res kind of storyline with Bilbo Baggins writing his book. This takes place directly before the events of Fellowship of the Ring. He flashes back to his adventures 60 years earlier and explains this whole backstory about the city of Dale, which is this city that is inhabited by dwarves and men. And then we have the lonely mountain called Erebor, which is the dwarf stronghold where the characters of Thorin and his father Thrain and his grandfather Thor are kind of like the rulers of this lonely mountain, and they have all this treasure, and they have this gem called the Arkenstone, which is this very valuable stone that everyone's kind of after as we get more and more into the story. And then when everything's all good and everything's thriving, we get the character of Smaug, who's this giant dragon who invades the town of Dale, destroys everything, invades the mountain of Erebor, wipes out nearly all the dwarves, and then takes over all the treasure. So then Thorin and a handful of dwarves escape from Erebor and are kind of like in the wastelands of Middle-Earth, and they're trying to regain their homeland. Then we have the character of Thranduil, who's kind of like the king of the Wood Elves, who is in alliance with the dwarves, but then as he sees the dwarves in peril, he decides to turn their back on them and then go away. And then in the extended version, the reason why is because the dwarves actually have these valuable gems that they kind of hid away from the elves, so that kind of causes the divide between them. So we cut to present day, we get introduced to the character of Bilbo, and we get the younger version of Bilbo, played by Martin Freeman, who actually probably out of all the characters, he's definitely one of my favorite actors from the cast. Just the way he played Bilbo, it's not quite how he is in the book, but I like how he kind of has the spirit of Bilbo and kind of makes it his own. So then Bilbo meets with Gandalf the Grey this time, who tells him about this whole mission to go to Erebor and reclaim it and defeat Smaug the dragon. But obviously they need a burglar to get in, someone who's small and can kind of evade Smaug, try to find his weak spot, and then give a chance for the dwarves to defeat him and then reclaim their mountain. So then Bilbo gets introduced to all 13 dwarves, who I won't name because there's just too many, and they try to convince him to join this mission, but Bilbo just wants to stay home. He loves his books, he loves his armchair, he loves his good food, but then he has that spirit of adventure because he's part Took, and the Took hobbits are these mischievous hobbits who are like always into adventure. So then, at the last minute, Bilbo decides to go with the dwarves and join the adventure, and then as the story goes on, they run into a bunch of different obstacles. They have encounter with 3 huge trolls, they get attacked by wargs, or these kind of like giant wolf things. They meet up with Elrond and the other elves. They encounter these giant rock creature things, which actually are not quite in the book. They're kind of more described as cave trolls, and they kind of produce like the sound of thunder because of their whole battle and everything. It's just like this small paragraph in the book, but then Peter Jackson expands it into this giant action sequence. So they go into the Misty Mountain for coverage. They get separated. The dwarves have an encounter with the goblins and Goblin King in Goblin Town, and then they encounter this giant fat goblin king with this giant gorder, and yeah, I won't really talk about that. But then on the flip side, Bilbo finally has his encounter with Gollum, which is probably one of the most accurate scenes in the movie. Bilbo actually finds the ring. They have their whole riddles in the dark scene, and then eventually Gollum finds out that he took the ring, goes after him, but then Bilbo puts the ring on, turns invisible, and gets away. The characters reunite with Gandalf's help. They're chased away by the wargs, and they're actually pursued by another character named Azog, who's this giant white orc who actually killed Thorin's grandfather in the whole battle outside Moria, and Thorin actually cut off Azog's hand, so now they're kind of wanting revenge on each other. So then they have their whole confrontation, but then Gandalf summons the eagles and saves all the characters, which, yeah, let's just talk about the eagles. I know in the book they come and save them, but then as time went on, Tolkien wanted the eagles to not come when it was like super convenient for the characters. They wanted to come when Middle-Earth was kind of mostly imbalanced, so it's a little bit of a contradiction after watching Lord of the Rings and then watching the Hobbit movies, where it's like, oh, you could have just taken the eagles all the way to Mordor and like destroyed the ring, but then Peter Jackson's interpretation, the Nazgul would have taken them out. They're not Middle-Earth taxis, but then here they kind of are Middle-Earth taxis, because it's kind of a contradiction, but it's also true of the book. So anyway, they get saved. Instead of the Eagles taking them all the way to Erebor, they kind of take them to this little mountain peak where Erebor is like way off in the distance. And then, Bilbo has this whole line of like, I do think the worst is behind us. But then we cut to Erebor, cut to the treasure room. The treasure slides off of Smaug's eye, and then he opens it up, and then we cut to black, and we realize like, oh shoot, the ring's not over yet. We still have this whole big dragon we have to confront. And that leads us right into Desolation of Smaug. And this is probably my favorite of the three movies. I mean, it's not saying a lot. It's probably the most rewatchable out of the three movies. But anyway, so we pick up where we left off. The characters are trying to run away from Azog and his forces. They get saved by the character of Beorn, who's this kind of like an animagus from Harry Potter. In his human form, he's this very tall man, but in his animal form, he's this black bear. So then he saves them, and they go to the Forest of Mirkwood, which is kind of like this dark forest that's been corrupted by Sauron's forces, and there's these giant spiders in there who are trying to kill the characters. But then they end up getting saved by Legolas, Tauriel, and a couple of the Wood Elves. And obviously, these characters were not in the book, but Peter Jackson wanted to put them in the movie in order to have that bridge from The Hobbit to Lord of the Rings. And I guess we'll just get into Legolas and Tauriel. I don't mind the fact that Legolas is in this movie. I think it's really cool to have that bridge because he's one of my favorite characters from the original trilogy, so it's cool seeing him here. Then the character of Tauriel, she could have been this really awesome character. Then one of the downsides is that they give her a love triangle between her, Legolas, and then one of the dwarves named Keely, who's like the hot dwarf, the beardless dwarf who looks like a mini version of Aragorn or something. So she kind of goes from like this being this really strong character, this being this really kind of like vulnerable character and everything. I know they're trying to add more female characters into The Hobbit because there's no mention of female characters in the book, except for like a brief mention of Galadriel. But yeah, I think they could have just gotten rid of the whole love triangle dynamic. It's kind of like a little meta reference to the fact that Evangeline Lilly was in a love triangle situation in the Lost series between her, Jack, and Sawyer. But anyway, so they get rescued, taken to Thranduil. Thorin has a whole confrontation with him. They get sent to prison, and then Bilbo, who actually got separated from the characters, comes in and then rescues him from the prison, puts him in the barrels, and we get the whole epic barrel chase sequence, which, obviously goes over the top and is very cartoony. But anyway, we won't dwell on that. So they get away. They meet up with the character of Bard the Bowman, who's actually another really cool character. Very Aragorn-esque. The fact that his father was the one who used a device called the Black Arrow to try to destroy the dragon Smaug, but it actually just bounced off his chest, and one of the scales fell off, creating this vulnerable spot in Smaug. So then the dwarves try to take this information and use it to slay Smaug in order to reclaim Erebor. So then we get introduced to the leader of Lake Town, and there's assistant Alfred, who are briefly mentioned in the book, but they're not really big characters. But the only reason why I kind of accept their inclusion in the movie is just to play on the theme of greed, with the fact that the master of Lake Town is really just all about the gold. He doesn't really care about the people. They're kind of in this kind of desolate town, and then that kind of mirrors where Thorin will end up once he actually reclaims Erebor and kind of gives into the dragon sickness and has this greed about all this treasure and everything, but we'll get to that in a second. So then the dwarves get away from Lake Town. We kind of have three different storylines going on, because during the whole barrel scene, Keely gets shot by a poison arrow from one of the orcs, and then is taken to Lake Town and kind of on the mend with a couple of the characters there. Azog's forces attack Lake Town, and Legolas and Tauriel come in to try to defend them, and Ariel has a kind of like awkward scene of her trying to heal Keely, and then the lights glowing behind her. I know it's like a callback to where Frodo got stabbed on the weathertop and like looks and sees Arwen walking up to him kind of glowing, but still kind of awkward here. So they have their storyline, and then we cut to the dwarves and Bilbo going into Erebor, trying to confront Smaug. Bilbo, in the book, he puts on the ring and then goes into the treasure room and has this whole confrontation with Smaug. But in this one, he doesn't have the rings, and they have their whole confrontation. Another meta reference, because Smaug is played by Benedict Cumberbatch, who played Sherlock in Sherlock, and then Martin Freeman plays Bilbo, who also played Watson in Sherlock. So it's kind of like them having another conversation again with each other. So then, as they're having a conversation, Smaug's trying to figure out like who Bilbo is and everything, like where did he come from, and then Bilbo actually lets it slip that he's called Barrel Rider, and that's kind of like a little hint to Lake Town. And then Smaug remembers that the people of Lake Town tried to kill him earlier with the whole black arrow, and then he kind of gets suspicious, like, are they trying to come in to steal my treasure and all this stuff? So then Smaug hints that he's going to destroy Lake Town. He breaks out of the treasure room. The dwarves have their whole fight with him, which, obviously wasn't in the book at all, but since the fact that this movie was going to be 2 films and they split into 3, they had to have a whole epic climax, and they have this whole improbable ending of the dwarves restarting the forge and then creating this giant gold statue of a dwarf that's not quite fully finished. So then it melts and then covers Smaug in all this gold, so they think he's dead, but then Smaug gets upset, bursts out the gold, bursts out of Erebor, goes to Lake Town, and then is about to destroy it. And then Bilbo and the dwarves are kind of like left like, what have we done? And then we kind of cuts to black, and then that leads us right into Battle of Five Armies. And then we have the whole epic opening scene of Smaug destroying Lake Town. Bard tries to fulfill his destiny, tries to shoot the black arrow at Smaug in his kind of weak spot, but the bow gets destroyed. So then he actually has to put the bow on his son to aim it. Fires the arrow, hits Smaug in his weak point. Smaug dies, falls on top of the master, kills him. Then their town is left all destitute, so they're wondering like, what are we going to do? So then the only choice is to go to the city of Dane, which is outside of Erebor, which has now been taken over by Thorin and the dwarves. And Thorin has his crown on. As I said earlier, he's giving in to the dragon sickness. He wants nothing to do with helping people. So then the men are left standing like, what do we do? And then Thranduil and then the rest of the elves make an alliance with Bard the Bowman in order to fight Thorin, in order to reclaim the mountain and have a home for the people of Lake Town. So they're in alliance. They try to reason with Thorin, but Thorin's having none of it. And then Bilbo, seeing this conflict that's about to come to light, and then also in the background, Azog and his forces actually coming to take over the mountain as well. He decides to take the Arkenstone and then take it to Bard and Thranduil in order to make peace with them so that there's no battle. Then Thorin obviously finds out about this. He gets upset with Bilbo, vanishes from the mountain, and then kind of slowly but surely kind of descends into his dragon sickness, kind of becomes like a shut-in within Erebor. And then the tension kind of grows and grows and grows. And then meanwhile, we cut to the character of Dane, this kind of Scottish dwarf thing with this kind of red hair mohawk and kilt and this giant hog thing that he rides, which is played by Billy Connolly, who was actually originally considered for the character of Gimli, but then he dropped out due to scheduling conflicts. So it's kind of cool seeing him here, but then he's digital. So I call him Digi-Dane because when Billy Connolly actually had the prosthetic on, Billy Connolly didn't come through, so they decided to have a digital version of him instead. So he's a Digi-Dane going against the elves and men to retake the Arkenstone and get rid of the elves because of their conflict they had. And then suddenly, when tensions are rising with that, more armies come in. You have Azog with his army, and then Bolg, his son, with his army. So now you finally have the Battle of Five Armies and everything that we've finally been leading up to, which is actually just a couple pages in the book, but obviously here is expanded to be the whole movie, which, because why not? Gotta make that money. So then we have the whole battle, which is pretty epic, but I guess the stakes aren't as dire because it's just a battle for treasure and not necessarily a battle for the fate of Middle-Earth. So obviously the stakes are gonna be a little bit lower, but I mean, it's still, pretty fun battle, I suppose. So then all the armies are clashing. Bilbo and the characters in the middle of it. Bilbo's trying to convince Thorin to end all this conflict. And then Thorin finally makes the decision to actually help. And I actually think this is like a really cool scene in the movie. He decides to charge out of Erebor with the other 12 dwarves and fight Azog and his forces. Then we get the whole rematch between Azog and Thorin. Thorin gets the upper hand on Azog, and he kind of goes into the water, and you think he's dead, but then he stabs Thorin's foot. He falls to the ground. Azog's about to stab Thorin, but then Thorin puts up his sword, but then he realizes that the only way out is to sacrifice himself, so he moves his sword out of the way. Azog stabs him, but then Thorin stabs Azog, so then Azog finally dies, and then Thorin's left dying. And then cut to Fili and Kili, who are killed by Bolg, but then Legolas and Tauriel come in this kind of impossible boss battle because Legolas and Bolg at their battle in Desolation of Smaug, so this is like a rematch. And then we get the whole kind of like video game-esque sequence of them on the bridge. Bolg tries to destroy the bridge, and then Legolas is kind of going up the falling debris, kills Bolg and everything, which is obviously very ridiculous, but whatever. It's the last movie. Why not have some kind of ridiculous moment with Legolas? So then Tauriel and Kili have their final moment together, and then finally the battle is all won. They have their victory. Bilbo, who was knocked out at the beginning of the battle, wakes up, sees that Thorin is dying. They have their last moment together of redemption. Thorin thanks Bilbo for redeeming him in the end, kind of like a little callback to Boromir sacrificing himself and then being redeemed in the end. Gandalf comes beside him. They sit down. They have their quiet moment. This is probably my favorite moment in the whole movie, where it's just quiet and the characters are kind of reflecting on their moments. And then we have their whole resolution. The dwarves stay in Erebor, having reclaimed their land. They open up Dane to the people of Lake Town. Bard becomes a new leader, and then Thranduil tells Legolas to go find a character named Strider, who obviously is a setup for the character of Aragorn, so that ties The Hobbit to Lord of the Rings. And then we finally get Bilbo returning to the Shire, seeing that all this stuff's being auctioned off, and then he realizes like, no, I'm not dead, I'm here, stop auctioning my stuff. So then he gets all of his stuff back, and then we have him, writing stuff down in his book. Then we fast forward to present day, where Bilbo's finishing up his book, The Hobbit, a little meta reference to the book, and then we hear the knock on the door, and then we get the lines from Fellowship of the Ring. No, thank you. We don't want any visitors, well wishes, or distant relations. And then Gandalf says, and what about very old friends? And then obviously that's a spark that gets Bilbo to the door, and then kind of leads us right back into Fellowship of the Ring. So everything's all full circle, reunited. Cut to credits, we get the amazing song from Billy Boyd, and then that's the end of the Hobbit trilogy. So obviously not as good as Lord of the Rings for multiple reasons, as I said earlier, but I think overall it's fine. It's definitely not something that I rewatch all the time. I don't have it on DVD and Blu-ray and everything. I just stream it on HBO Max or something. But yeah, it's not really my thing. But it was fun watching it at the time. I was in college when I watched the movies, and I watched each movie in theaters, so it was kind of cool seeing, because I hadn't watched Lord of the Rings in theaters because I was a little too young. But watching the Hobbit movies is like a tradition for like me and my roommates. We would go and have fun. It was cool being back in Middle-Earth. But yeah, I'm glad that it's finally over. We kind of get all the answers that we needed that was set up in Lord of the Rings. All the questions that we were wanting, like what happened in the Hobbit, what did it look like, and all this stuff. We got the Rings of Power show, which is pretty good, not as good as Lord of the Rings, but I think a little bit better than the Hobbit. I know it got mixed reviews here and there, but overall I think it was pretty cool. So we'll see what happens if it gets a second season or not. And then I think there's like rumors that there'll be more Middle-Earth stuff, just because there's just so much to tell with these books and everything. So yeah, I'm excited to see more. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to give this video a like and subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you next time. My precious.